Good evening. It is just so wonderful to see everybody here and come to learn about our efforts to get some justice in this province in what former Police Chief Dave Scott has called the largest injustice this province has ever seen. Now, I'm going to have 4 people speak who were involved in this saga. And the first person I'm going to have call up here is Blair Pischak. Now, this is quite an interesting story because I just have to explain briefly to you. Back in 1990, that was when Aboriginal youth, 17-year-old Neil Stonechild, froze to death. And then in 2000, the RCMP reinvestigated the story, and they used as their chief witness, indeed their only witness, against 2 Saskatoon police officers, a fellow named Jason Roy. And Jason Roy ultimately had 50 run-ins with the law. But by the time in 2000 and 2001, when the investigation was going on, he had already had a lengthy criminal record. And what the public doesn't know is that Jason Roy actually had kidnapped at knifepoint a citizen in Saskatoon, and he later pled guilty to a charge in relation to that and was found guilty and sentenced. So that's who I would like to call upon. This is Blair Pischak, who in 1996 thought he was going to die at the hands of Jason Roy. And it's very interesting to hear what Blair has to say about the RCMP 4 years later deciding to use the word of this convicted criminal against the word of 2 cops who by then had more than a decade of exemplary policing under their belts. So, Blair?
Good evening. Am I loud enough? Yeah, okay. As Candace had mentioned, I'm a character in her book, and I'm a character in chapter 2, if you get around to that chapter. A little bit about me first. Before I was a character in the book, I was born into a middle-class family in Saskatoon, raised in a good home, worked towards becoming an addictions counselor, spent a number of years working in the addictions field at Calder Center. I had a number of life events converge that I ended up handling quite poorly, and I had a relapse back into my addiction, which leads to why I was on the street the night Jason Roy took me. On January 2nd, 1996, I was at a friend's place at an apartment on 20th Street and about Avenue N. I had stepped out for a few minutes to go to the store, and when I had returned, somebody had knocked a hole in the buzzer where you would press to get back into the apartment. It was around 9:30, quarter to 10 that night. It was a January night, cold, and I knew there was a payphone on 20th Street and Avenue P. Having grown up in that area many years earlier, I made my way to the payphone, driving my car, and I called my friend Marcel and explained to him that I can't get back into your place. Could you please buzz me? I'll be back there in a few minutes. While I was on the phone with Marcel, I saw 3 men walking towards me east on 20th Street, on the north side of 20th Street, eastbound, coming up to the intersection of 20th Street and Avenue P. I had a bad feeling as they got to the intersection, and I could see them talking amongst themselves. Unfortunately, mine was the only car on the block that night, and I was the only one standing on the street, and my car was about 15 feet from me and running, so I had made myself a target, and I'd realized it at that point that there might be trouble. I had hung up the call with Marcel. The call ended, but I stayed on the phone, trying to make it look like I was still on the phone to maybe get these guys to just kind of pass by me and not notice that I was there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I was grabbed out of the payphone, told that we're going into my car and we're going for a drive. there's not a lot of time to think what you're going to do in those situations, especially when there's nobody around, and two of them are bigger than I am, and they look like they could probably do me great harm. I got into my car. Jason Roy was beside me. A fellow by the name of Elton Dusty Horn was behind me on the passenger side. And I never did get the other fellow's name. I was told to drive around, and drive I did, while being hit in the head and having a knife in my ribs. About 15 minutes into the drive, they were starting to argue amongst themselves about what they were going to do with me and where they wanted to go. As I was listening to this, I started to get the impression that they didn't really want me around, they just wanted the car. But I was concerned, what were they going to do with me to get the car? I tried to make small talk, but that only led to getting hit more and having a knife kind of jabbed towards me and told to shut up and keep driving. At some point, we were eastbound on 20th Street, approaching Avenue H. There was a bingo over on Avenue H and 20th Street at that time that was open with a number of cars in the parking lot. And right at that time, one of them said, "Pull over." And so I did. I pulled over right beside the bingo, the best place I could think to pull over. As I tried to make more small talk and ask them what they were going to do, the same thing kept happening. The hits in the head and some pretty aggressive comments towards me. It was at that time that Jason Roy had pulled the knife away and turned to look at the guys in the back, and I made my great escape. I ran from the car into the bingo and was met by security who acted very quickly to get the police there. I did turn around and look at my car being taken and driving away, but that wasn't my concern at that point. It was only minutes later, maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes later, a number of police showed up and were taking a statement from me when another of the officers came and said, "We've located your car. You need to come with us and see if you can identify these three people." At that point, my only thought was, there goes my nice sports car, because that's what it was, a nice sports car. My life was safe.
Sports car is so much more important than anything else.
It was to me at the time, ma'am.
Well, maybe at the
You're
time.
interrupting a witness speaking, ma'am. Show respect, please. Show respect for the speaker.
I told you the rules to come in here. Abide by them, or leave. I
Now
know
you've
people
broken
who
the
died.
rules. Now you've broken the rules. We'll ask you to leave.
And the truth is that the cops were the ones that killed Neil Stonechild.
Let's go.
And, okay, don't touch me. Don't touch me.
You're
That's assault.
absolutely-
That's
That's not
assault.
assault.
That
You're-
is assault.
No, you're
Don't
supposed to
touch
leave.
her. That is assault.
She asked you when you have to leave.
That
You
is
have
assault.
private property, you have to
You're on
leave.
private property.
Let's go.
You are disrupting a proceeding. You agreed to be calm and
I didn't
polite.
agree. I didn't agree.
Okay.
Justice, no peace, no
Okay.
racist,
Okay.
no
Assault.
peace,
That's
no
assault.
justice,
That's
no
assault.
peace,
Assault.
no racist,
Neil
no peace.
Stonechild
Listen,
deserves
just
to
leave.
rest in peace.
Leave. You're not gonna
He
listen
does
to
not
that. This is
deserve
private property.
this. Neither does his family. That is the injustice of this.
And these people do not deserve your
They deserve, no, I'm not being racist. How am I being racist?
attitude.
How
Our
am I?
attitude being racist when we're here just defending one of our own.
Then you go
Exactly.
outside on public property and defend.
Why
In here,
why
this
was
is
it
a
public
private
forum
meeting.
then?
This is a private
Why
meeting.
can't,
You
why
are
can't Real be respected and rest in peace? Why can his family not be able to deal with
The only thing that will let
this?
him rest in peace is the truth.
And the truth
you
is-
are trying to stop it.
No, I'm not.
No, we're
Yes,
not.
you
No, we're
are.
not. The truth is that those cops took him out there and they left him for dead.
This is
That
the
is what the
first
truth
time.
is.
Back to
We've
the
done
line.
it many, many times over. I know people that have survived the Twilight Tours.
Then go file a report. File a
Why?
complaint, but don't come here and start
Why
disrupting the
when the
proceedings.
police themselves have threatened their families? I'm gonna kill your family if you report. You know how many
Madam,
we have?
madam, you can bring up any kind of story you want. You can tell any kind of lie that you want, but you cannot
George,
come
why
in here.
are you
You
accusing
can,
me
you
of lying?
cannot
Why
come in here
can't
and
Neil and
disrupt
his
the
family,
proceedings.
why
not
can't
lying.
Neil
Why are you
rest
accusing
in
me
peace?
of lying?
Why can't his
What?
family move on? Why? Because this keeps coming up.
Because
That's
two
why.
men's lives
Excuse
were
me.
destroyed by
Excuse me.
you.
No, no.
One
A
young
whole
man is
family.
dead because of
Yeah, and a whole family has been ruined because of it.
Hello, order,
That's what it is.
order.
No peace. No racism.
Ladies and gentlemen,
You
hey,
can phone the police and have you removed. That's the option we have, or we can have security from here kick you out. I've asked you politely to leave. Everyone here has agreed to come in.
I never
Whether you
agreed,
open your mouth or not, you walk through the door after the
but
agreement
I
was
didn't
made.
say yes
There
or
was
no.
no agreement.
Order.
Agreement. Say yes or no.
excuse me. If any of the people who want to protest, if you want to hang around after the meeting on the sidewalk, I will be more than happy to meet with you. I'll be more than happy to answer any question you have regarding Neil's death. And I'm going to tell you that I'm offering that out of respect for Neil. I'm offering that out of respect for Neil's family.
Well, if you're offering respect for his
I'm,
family,
un-
why is this still
until,
going
excuse
on
me,
then?
excuse me,
Leave
I'm
it.
trying,
Let him die in
I'm trying to
peace.
be
His
reasonable
family
with you.
deserves to
I'm
move
trying
on
to be
and
reasonable
to
with you.
heal.
I'm willing to stop after the meeting and answer any questions you have in a respectful manner and try to explain why this is happening. Because there are a lot more victims here than I think anybody realizes. And one of the messages that I have here tonight is that it isn't just Larry and Brad that are the victims here. This whole
Larry
province.
and Brad aren't
Excuse-
even victims.
Excuse me.
The victims is the
When
Stonechild family.
if you want to have this discussion, I will gladly have it with you
Well, let's
and
have this discussion now.
outside after we're done.
What's wrong with having it right now?
Because this isn't a discussion. You're yelling at everyone.
I'm not yelling. I'm
You're
raising my
yelling.
voice.
You're yelling. You're not letting other people put their points forward. There will be ample opportunity for questions at the end. And if you have any questions, I'm telling you, I will gladly answer you everything to the best of my ability. Because it isn't, we can have different
The
opinions.
family is being
Excuse me.
victimized.
I let you talk, didn't I?
That is what's
I
going
let
on.
you talk, didn't I? And we can have different opinions, and I'm quite willing to explain to you why I have my opinion.
Okay, well then
And-
explain it then. Let's hear
And
it.
I've already told you after the meeting, I'm quite willing to meet with you.
And why can't you do it
So I'll
now?
see
I'm
you after
standing
the
right
meeting.
here.
I'll see you after the meeting, because you're out of order.
I'm not out of order.
You're out of order.
I have
This
a
is,
right to
all you're
freedom of
doing,
speech.
you've come in here to disrupt.
Yes, I do. I have the
This
right to
isn't
speak
honoring Neil's
anywhere I
memory
want.
either.
This is completely honoring Neil's memory.
No,
We're
it
standing
isn't.
up for
Standing
him.
here and yelling
Let
in a
him
public
die in
place is
peace.
not.
Let his family be.
I will meet with you and I'll answer your questions. Okay, I'll see you outside after.
I'm sure you will.
I'll see you outside
I
after.
doubt it. I doubt it. Because
You
nobody
lose
has
that bet.
answered any questions so far
You would lose
about
that bet. I'll see
anything.
you afterwards.
I doubt it. Nobody has answered any questions in
I will
regard
see
to
you
this.
afterwards.
Because all you're doing is re-victimizing the
nothing
family.
We already
to
have the
hide.
answers, sir.
Yeah, the answers were given at
I
the
will see
inquiry.
you
So
afterwards
why-
outside. Have a
So
good
why
night.
say these two cops are the
I will
victims when
see
they're
you
not?
afterwards outside. I will answer
The
all
only
your
victims is the
questions.
Stonechild
I will
family and
see
nobody
you
can
afterwards
handle that.
outside.
Because
and
that
I'll
is the
answer all
truth.
your questions. I would
That's
be
the
more than
truth.
happy to.
That's the truth.
Because I respect this whole process. And I would expect
If
that
you
you would show
respected the
some
whole
respect
process,
for.
if you
I
respected
would
the whole
expect
process, then
I will
why try
talk
to
to you
reopen the
after,
whole case? Why
outside
try
the
to
meeting.
reopen
He
it?
has given
I
his
will
word
talk to
for
you
the
after,
witnesses, he will talk to you.
outside the
I'm
meeting.
not talking to you. I'm not talking
I
to
will
you
talk to
here.
you
I'm
after, outside the
speaking
meeting.
to him.
How come it has
I
to
will
be
talk to you after,
Why can't we
outside
do
the
it
meeting.
now?
Why can't it be
I
now?
will talk, because this is not the forum.
Because
You're out-
what's said
you're-
in here,
You
after
are
we
out
leave,
of order.
you're not gonna say
doing
it out
in
there.
this fashion.
That's why.
You're in here and you're yelling and you're causing a scene.
Well,
I
you're
will
yelling
talk-
just as much, sir. We're
That's
just
because I'm on a mic.
your voice.
And we
Okay?
have the right of freedom of speech where we want, when we want.
You don't have the right on private property. This is private property and you've been
This
asked
was
to
a
leave.
public event. You invited the public, and here we are.
And it's private property. You've been asked to
But
leave.
it's a public
I'll see you
event.
afterwards out front.
It's a public
I
event.
will see you
That's
afterwards
the
out front.
difference. When it's a public event,
You have
anybody
your
is
laws
welcome.
all mixed up, ma'am.
No, I don't. No, I don't.
I
I know
think
my
you guys
rights.
have your laws a little bit mixed up. What do you think?
Okay, we'll talk about that too afterwards.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will.
Well, you won't find out until you leave.
Why should I leave? Because what you're going to say in here isn't going to be said out there. Because
Sit quietly and listen. Listen to what he says, and then you'll know.
Talk to you
why do I
after.
need to know? You know, it's already known. Those police
I will
officers
talk to you after
killed
outside after the
Neil
meeting.
Stonechild.
We
That's
go.
known. It was in the inquiry. And
I
all
will
that this
talk to
book
you
and everything
afterwards.
is doing
Where you guys
is
go?
re-victimizing the family.
Is there someone from the events club
Here
here?
to say, they made your point, now please.
We're not leaving. We're not leaving. The reason we're yelling is because we don't believe this should be happening at all.
Okay, but you haven't heard any of the reasons and you're already yelling.
Is that correct? Yes.
Oh, Candace McLean's got to go. Hey, hey. Ho, ho. Candace McLean's got to go. Hey, hey. Ho, ho. Candace McLean's got to go. Hey, hey.
Hey, hey!
Candace McLean's got to go. Hey, hey.
What are you going to charge me for? Candace, what are you going to charge me for? I have it on video that these guys touched me and assaulted me. That's assault. Laying your hands on me is assault.
We can legally remove you. You asked to leave, and you didn't leave. We can
You
physically
put your hands on me right away when I started
Because
speaking.
we can
That
physically
is
remove
assault.
you when you were listening.
You have
You
no
don't know
right
the
to
law.
touch me.
You don't know the law.
You have no right to touch me.
I know. You can see that.
Of course not. I'm stubborn and I'm hard-headed. You know why? Because that's how I was raised. Darn right I am. Darn right. I am ignorant. Yes, I am. And you know why I'm ignorant? No, I am ignorant.
Get it all.
I am ignorant because my family is being disrespected.
Are you a Stonechild?
You damn right I am. And I'm proud to be a Stonechild.
And what?
Stonechild there,
And
baby.
why do you want to then refer to them as the family?
Because they are my family. They are my family.
And then we will know where you're coming from.
But I'm talking about the immediate family.
You're getting into semantics.
So
Yeah,
there you go.
sure.
There you go.
That's family right there. What's the matter? What relationship
There's
to
nothing
you?
the matter with being related.
She
Nice
is
to know where people are
defending
coming
her
from.
family member that should be buried and
These
be
people are
respected.
sitting very quietly and respectfully trying to hear.
No, leave them out.
We all have our places.
Other
all
people
have
are
our
standing
places.
back doing nothing. She is the only one.
Some people talk.
No,
The
she's
rest of
not
you
the
are
only
welcome to
one.
stay. Or you.
I'll keep yelling if she
Wanted me
comes.
to answer your question.
Miss, you've already proven that you don't want to know. You won't read the book, so
I
your
never said
comments
I
are
won't read the
irrelevant.
book. I never said I won't.
Questions answered or not?
Sam's going outside to answer your questions. He's going out there right now. Justified First Station murder! Woo!
Only to learn that many of the charges were dropped or plea bargained away or reduced significantly. It was about a year after that episode, I guess it was about 2 years after that episode, one of the players in that episode from that night was killed. And I often think about him, wondering what could have been had he had an opportunity like I had, because it was shortly after this episode that I found recovery again and got away from all of that. I had put a lot of this behind me for many years until Candace had contacted me about her book. And it brought up a lot of memories and a lot of feelings of injustice in my case, injustice against two fine police officers, I believe, and injustice for Neil Stonechild, and I believe for the entire province. That's my experience with Jason Roy. That was in 1996, and I believe it was in 2000 he came forward and had all this information, and to this day I don't believe it. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. And I'm especially impressed that Blair came out tonight because he had a heart attack a couple of nights ago. But he so badly wanted to come and tell his experience, where he actually told me he thought at one point that he was going to die. So our next speaker is Larry Hartwig, and he is a police officer who, was a police officer who at midlife had his innocent life completely derailed and has worked very hard ever since to get justice.
Thanks everybody for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's really good to see some of our former police officers and still friends of mine, I guess, out here. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. If it wasn't for my wife and my family, I would not be here today, at least not on this earth. So I thank them. For my friends who are here today, I thank them. I honor you. I honor Candace McLean for taking this project on, for becoming an object of hate by the ignorant people who would rather hate than respect people. So my friend Bernie is going to be my assistant here. I know he doesn't have anything attire that would be revealing or anything like that, but you know, we'll go from there. All you need is an index finger, okay? So, slide 2, please. An unfortunate and preventable death. I will speak briefly about each one of those categories listed on the slide. The reason is there is so much evidence concerning these injustices that at best, I can barely cover a couple of the most compelling related to the case. I want you to keep in mind that simple truth. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Slide 3. On the night Neil Stonechild died, he was wanted on an outstanding warrant. He wanted to turn himself in on the warrant, but he wanted to party one last time. For Neil, partying meant getting drunk. His family was worried that he would get into trouble. The group home operator where he was UAL from, who put out the warrant for his arrest, phoned him at the party and wanted him to turn himself in. Neil stated that he was already drinking and that drinking would be a breach of his conditions and therefore more criminal charges. The group home operator, although she had a responsibility to Neil, did not apprehend him like she was required to by law. Neil Stonechild died. The last person to have contact with him was Jason Roy. He was interviewed by SPS investigator Keith Jarvis on November 30th, 1990. He provided his own handwritten statement, page and a half long, which is summarized as follows. He and Neil went to the party where they split a 40-ounce bottle of Silent Sam vodka. They went to a nearby apartment complex to look for a friend. Jason Roy and Neil Stonechild argued twice, but Jason Roy could not remember why, and then he said he blacked out. This is all written in his own hand. Trent Ewart was the person who called the police to report Neil Stonechild as being drunk and causing problems. He provided a statement where he outlined the circumstances of the complaint and that the police had attended his apartment that night to address the complaint. I was one of those officers. There's a woman named Sharon who was at the party that Neil and Jason left. She said that Neil and Jason arrived with a bottle of Silent Sam vodka. She went out for coffee and returned later. When Jason Roy returned to the party by himself, he told her that he and Neil had words and went their separate ways. She noted that Jason Roy was intoxicated, passed out in her home, and woke up sick the next day. Neil was found dead some 5 days later in an industrial area miles away from the party. There was no explanation for how he got there. He died of hypothermia. Neil's family believed that he was beaten up and dropped off there. They suspected the person who did it was Gary Pratt, since Neil was to testify against Gary and some of his friends for a robbery charge. Gary Pratt threatened several people, including Neil Stonechild, that he would kill him if he ratted them out. Sergeant Jarvis, there's no doubt Sergeant Jarvis did an incomplete report. He concluded the file after 5 days. He concluded that Neil was trying to turn himself in on the outstanding warrant just like he promised to, either at the correctional center, which was nearby where his body was found, or to the group home operator that he promised to turn himself over to. Either that, or he started walking and froze to death because he was intoxicated. No one believed that Neil would attempt to turn himself into the correctional center, including me. Neil's family turned to Constable Ernie Luter for help. He too believed that Gary Pratt had a real motive for seeing Neil dead. Jarvis dismissed his concerns, perhaps because the charges against Gary were dropped a month before because nobody would testify against Gary Pratt. The charges against the 3 others were still before the courts at the time for robbery with violence. Slide 4. February 17, 2000, one of the journalists who suggested that the police were responsible for the freezing deaths stated, and I guess I have to step away from the mic. Oh. For the police to be torturing and killing people they don't like, as bad as it gets, after this, it's only a question of how many. How many people were driven out of town by the police crews that are left to freeze to death? How many more will turn up in the spring when the snow melts? How many others were thrown into the river to turn up downstream days or weeks later? How many officers were involved? How many looked the other way? Okay? This assumption made by journalists at the time, that the police were responsible for these deaths, was based on a few chance circumstances and a whole lot of assumptions. One has to remember that in the absence of information, a person can and will adopt erroneous information as fact, especially if that source of information is somebody who is trusted, like the media, or from some government agency. This credible evidence, repeated for days to years, incited a culture of fear, suspicion that were turned to anger, hatred, and revenge, as we've seen today. So in other words, bullshit baffles brains. A couple of weeks after this first story broke, Jason Roy told a completely different story than he told in 1990. That at the night of the party, he saw Neil in the back of a police car, handcuffed, blood gushing from his nose, and screaming, "They're going to kill me," referring to the police. The RCMP reluctantly investigated the allegation after pressure was brought to bear on them by the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. Slide 5. So the RCMP noted the details of the disturbance call, the very same call from which Jason Roy's allegation originated from. They noted that at 11:49 p.m. Trent Ewert called the police. They noted at 11:51 patrol officers received the call, car 38, myself and Brad Senger, and that we were on the way. At 11:56 we arrived in the area and immediately checked a male on foot 3 blocks from Snowberry Downs. This was Jason Roy, who lied about who he was. He lied because he was just involved in the disturbance. He would tell a completely different story years later. At 11:59, we conducted a CPIC on the name of Neil Stonechild. We ran him on the computer database. At 12:04 a.m., we ran a computer check on the name of Bruce Janai. At 12:17, we concluded the call as Neil Stonechild being gone on arrival. The RCMP confirmed that Jason Roy lied about who he was and provided the police with the name Tracy Lee Horse, which I had in my notebook that night. The RCMP officers noted that the officers had checked Neil Stonechild's name on the computer, proof that he was in our custody at the time. Of course, they didn't seem to know what custody meant. We in Saskatoon have a different definition, apparently. The RCMP were aware, however, that Neil Stonechild's name was also queried the same way 5 different times by 5 different police officers long after Neil Stonechild was dead. So if the RCMP theory holds true, Neil should have been present when those other queries were made as well, as long as 3 months after his death. The RCMP officers spoke to Saskatoon police officers, including my training officer, who advised the RCMP that querying a person on CPIC while en route or upon arriving at the scene is standard operating procedure for us. And they knew that themselves because that's their practice as well. Nevertheless, they ignored this and said Neil Stonechild must have been in custody when that CPIC query was conducted. The RCMP interviewed Bruce Janai, who confirmed that he was checked sometime that night, the same night as the disturbance call. Bruce said he was checked by 2 police officers, and at the time, nobody was in the back of the police car. This created a problem for the RCMP. If Neil Stonechild was in my car at 11:56, he must have disappeared. Because at 8 minutes later, he was not in the back of my police car. And the distance between where we checked Bruce Chennai and checked Jason Roy was only 1 block. So the RCMP found a potential remedy. He must have been checked earlier in the evening, right? And we must have only queried him later at 12:04 when it was more convenient for us to do so. Like looking for a kid on a Canada-wide UAL warrant. It does not stand the test at all. They also didn't seem to consider that Bruce Chennai's name, address, and date of birth appeared in my notebook immediately after the name Jason Roy used that night. The street checks and the CPIC checks sync perfectly in chronological order, but that didn't suit the RCMP. The RCMP had the original photos where Neil was found and the autopsy. They felt that the marks could indicate an assault which was consistent with Jason Roy's allegation. It might well surprise everyone here that the RCMP and Justice made no attempt whatsoever to establish the marks on Neil Stonechild's body were caused by handcuffs. They were simply going to present the illusion that they were. The RCMP consulted a top forensic pathologist who stated that the marks on Neil Stonechild's body were likely caused by a face fall first in the snow, and the mark on his hand was caused by clothing, just as the original pathologist concluded. The RCMP asked this pathologist if handcuffs could have made the marks. He said it was possible, but they didn't ask him to do that. They simply ran away with that offhand comment, and they set out to prove the allegation. They found a map maker who stated that the marks were consistent with handcuffs made 45 minutes to 2 hours before Neil's death. When a SAS Justice representative contacted the RCMP to tighten up that timeline, Robertson stated that they were made 45 minutes from the time of his death. And he gave that opinion the same day the Justice official contacted the RCMP. Again, bullshit baffles brains. The RCMP contacted me in April 2000 and asked about my knowledge of the victims. I told the RCMP that the only person that they were investigating that I knew was Neil Stonechild. I told them what I remembered about Neil and his family. I recalled that there was something about the investigation that was not quite right, but I could not recall what it was at the time. The officer asked me if I was working November 24th, 1990, and who I would have been working with at the time. I told him I didn't know. The date didn't mean anything to me. I volunteered to supply any contacts that I had with Neil Stonechild. And I came up with 3 incidents where I had contact or some dealings indirectly with Neil Stonechild. When I gave the RCMP officer that information, I told him, hey, listen, I'm sure there are more contacts than these three incidents, but I can't find them based on the search parameters I had at the time. I checked my notes, and I discovered that I was the one that took the disturbance call that night on November 24th, 1990. My notes indicated that I was working by myself that night. I knew that the allegation involved 2 police officers. I phoned the RCMP immediately and told them about what I discovered, and I knew that I had to go talk to the RCMP immediately to clear myself as a suspect. That's what I did. When I sat down with the RCMP officer, he was not interested in finding out anything that I knew. He was merely trying to convince me that I encountered Neil Stonechild that night and I had him in custody. They thought that custody meant Neil Stonechild was also in the back of my car, handcuffed, beat up, and screaming they're going to kill me. The definition of custody is any physical or mental control over a person. When we conducted the street checks of Jason Roy and Bruce Chennai that night, they were never in my car, but they were in custody. So the RCMP officer convinced me that I had encountered Neil Stonechild that night, that Neil Stonechild lied about who he was, just like Jason Roy did, and produced his cousin's name. because Neil Stonechild's cousin was Bruce Chennai. I acknowledged the possibility that I had him in custody. I denied any wrongdoing whatsoever related to Neil's death or any time within my career. Again, bullshit baffles brains. The RCMP spoke with Keith Jarvis a total of 8 times. Now, if you remember, Keith Jarvis was the original investigator. In his first contacts with the RCMP, he stated he only had a vague memory of Neil's death. He was certain that no one ever suggested the police were involved in Neil's death. Over time, and with suggestions by the RCMP, he remembered more information as the RCMP provided information about what they believed to be true. This included information that was not part of the investigation report and not part of Jarvis's original notes. Again, bullshit baffles brains. Jason Roy insisted that he spoke to the investigating officer at the time and he saw Neil Stonechild in the back of the patrol car. He insisted that he spoke with investigators months later and repeated his claims. No officer ever heard of these allegations until 2000. The RCMP tried to convince Jarvis that he spoke with Jason Roy, not once, but twice. And it was at this second meeting that Jason Roy told him about seeing Neil in a police car. Jarvis stated he could have met Neil or Jason a second time, but he was certain that he never heard any allegations that the police were involved in any way related to Neil's death. The RCMP then took that as an admission and they spooled it back to November 30th, 1990, that Jason Roy told Jarvis November 30th, 1990, that he saw Neil in police custody. The RCMP officers involved misrepresented this information and recorded that Jarvis confessed to Jason Roy disclosing to him. The commission investigator that was hired for the public inquiry did the same thing. He taped an interview with Jarvis, and there were some 200 starts and stops in that audio tape. In a year and a half into their 8-year investigation, the RCMP received an original copy of the report from Constable Ernie Ludet, who was looking into this case on behalf of the Stonechild family in 1990. This report provided conclusive evidence, critical evidence that the RCMP needed to conduct a meaningful investigation. They discovered the copy of Jason Roy's statement where he mentioned nothing about the police whatsoever. They had the statement of Trent Ewart, who confirmed that the police, we responded to the apartment that night. And they had disclosure from a woman named Shannon, who said when Jason Roy returned to the party by himself, the only thing he mentioned was that he and Neil argued and went their separate ways, just like he confirmed in his statement at the time. The RCMP ignored all this information. Instead of re-interviewing Jason Roy for criminal mischief, because now they had grounds to lay criminal charges against Jason Roy, they gave Jason Roy's lawyer a copy of his 2 statements. The November 30th, 1990 statement where he mentioned nothing about the police, and the March 7th, 2000 statement where he mentioned, I saw Neil in the back of a police car bleeding, screaming, they're gonna kill me. The RCMP knew one was the truth and one was a lie. They didn't seem to care. In fact, the fact that the RCMP ignored this critical evidence, the fact that the RCMP gave Jason Roy the 2 statements so he could cook up another story, it is, in my opinion, and many people's opinion, obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting criminal mischief, and breach of public trust. But apparently, it's not. I will disclose the reasons why they ignored this in just a little while. After the discovery of the report and the investigation stalled, the media carried a news story. Prosecutors are preparing to lay more charges against Saskatoon police officers, and that prosecutors are deciding whether to lay charges of criminal negligence causing death or manslaughter in the Stonechild case. Although justice officials stated that the file had not even been received by the prosecutor's office and it was a false news story, journalists stood by the story and said their sources were unimpeachable. Sorry. This is one of the many false news stories produced by the media in this case. Again, bullshit baffles brains. 7. So a public inquiry is meant to thoroughly examine issues of great public importance. It is not to be used as a substitute for a trial, as there are few, if any, restrictions on the evidence, including hearsay. Anything goes at a public inquiry. A person has no ability to call evidence or defend themselves. They have absolutely no ability to defend themselves or call evidence. A highly publicized event could be prejudicial if a person is blamed for something. It's right in the act. Judges are prohibited from doing this. A person so named would never be able to clear their name. At the public inquiry, Jason Roy changed his story once again. He stated he provided 2 statements in 1990. The first statement he made to Jarvis, where he claimed Neil was in the back of the police car, was the truth, and the second one made to another officer on December 20th, 1990, 3 weeks later, where he removed his allegation, was completely false. Okay? The only thing is, how did a December 20th, 1990 statement was already attached to the file that Constable Ernie Ludet copied on December 4th, 1990, unless a person can go back in time? It's impossible. But guess what? The RCMP bought it. David Wright bought it. It's impossible. Before the public inquiry, several senior justice officials interviewed Gary Robertson, the handcuff expert, about his evidence. Had they done any due diligence whatsoever, they would have determined what we learned at the public inquiry. The handcuff expert lied about his qualifications, training, and experience. He provided opinions that were discovered not to be his own, but from a doctor he consulted in Phoenix, Arizona. He made no attempt to determine if handcuffs could make the marks in the first place. He could not provide any explanation or demonstrate how handcuffs could have made the marks. Plaxton, he was the lawyer for the police service, police association. Yeah. Drew Plaxton to Gary Robertson, did you do any research as to whether physically it could be done? That's the marks to be caused by handcuffs. Robertson stated he did not. The commissioner stepped in, but you weren't asked to do that by the RCMP, were you? He confirmed that he was not. The commissioner, or Plaxton, said, okay, let's do a little experiment here. I want you to take these handcuffs and I want you to demonstrate how the marks on Neil Stonechild's nose could have been caused by handcuffs. Robertson stated, I don't know, it would be all hypothetical. Transcript inquiry report 4291 to 4295 if you want the actual testimony. When the commissioner already heard from the forensic experts who stated the mark was not or unlikely to be caused by clothing, Robertson was not to testify on anything other than his measurements. But then the commissioner seemed to qualify him as a forensic pathologist, even though the only applied science that he could muster is that he took high school chemistry. Commissioner, what is your sense, just globally speaking, as to whether or not those marks could have been caused by clothing? Robertson replied, it was difficult to say. He knew he was not to testify in this regard. The commissioner said, and I quote, I gather that you're saying it would be a remote possibility? Robertson said it would be very remote in my opinion. With that question, David Wright qualified Gary Robertson as a court-qualified forensic expert, which is much like saying, I'm qualified to be a structural engineer because I'd once built a garden shed. There was a witness that came forward to claim that he saw Neil Stonechild some 2 hours after he was at Snowberry Downs and 12 blocks from where his body was found. Although the statement was obtained by the RCMP, this was not disclosed to us at the public inquiry. Many, too, think this is an obstruction of justice. There was not full and complete disclosure as required by law. Jarvis testified that he made allegations that the RCMP manipulated evidence to fit Jason Roy's allegation, just as I did at the public inquiry. Commissioner, to Jarvis, because it seems to me what Mr. Jarvis is saying, in effect, that the RCMP concocted this whole interview, that they put together the interview and they made a series of suggestions to him, in effect, to encourage him, to induce him to make statements about things that he said he has no recollection of. And this is a very serious accusation. Counsel for the FSI and Cy Halleck spoke up and stated this calls into question the integrity of the RCMP and the public inquiry, and that the public inquiry needed to hear from the RCMP officers who investigated this case, as well as commission counsel, which the allegations were against him as well. Commissioner, well, one of the concerns I have, it calls into question the conduct and the integrity of the RCMP. Halleck, counsel for FSIN, as well as the commission investigator, absolutely. Although these three people, two RCMP officers and one former RCMP officer, were scheduled to testify, they were excluded from testifying. We could not question them. We could not challenge them on their assumptions. This too, I believe, is an obstruction of justice. The RCMP supervisor, Daryl McFadden, testified in their place. When he was asked by Drew Plaxton if there was any evidence of police misconduct related to Neil Stonechild's death, he admitted that the RCMP did everything possible to find out how and why Neil Stonechild died. He confirmed on the stand, under oath, that the RCMP could find no evidence of such misconduct by any Saskatoon police officer. Was anybody at the public inquiry convinced that the marks on Neil Stonechild's hand or face were caused by handcuffs? Not when you consider that counsel for Jason Roy and the Stonechild family introduced evidence that another object altogether may have produced those marks. And that exhibit was industrial wire ties, plastic wire ties. That was what was put forward as the source of the marks. Was anybody convinced that myself and my partner that night had time to drive Neil to the north end to drop him off? Not when you consider that counsel for the FSIN suggested that the paddy wagon or patrol wagon dropped Neil Stonechild off instead of myself and Constable Senger. In fact, the term paddy wagon or patrol wagon appears in the transcripts 56 times for counsel by the FSIN, counsel for the Stonechild family, and counsel for the Commission of Inquiry. When the public inquiry finished hearing evidence, the same journalist who made the allegation that the police were responsible said something different. And I quote, "If the police were involved in Stonechild's death, no one's been able to prove it or disprove it, unfortunately. But this is Canada. People under suspicion here get the benefit of doubt. And in this case, there's more doubt than anything else. The officers were subjected to repeated interrogations through taped telephone conversations and through days of cross-examined by a parade of skeptical courtroom lawyers. Both constables emerged with their testimony unshaken. Granted, they were unable to prove conclusively that they were innocent, but they don't have to. It's up to others to prove their guilt. With insufficient evidence to even lay a charge against Hartwig and Senger, much less convict them, they have to be presumed innocent. To do otherwise would only compound the injustice already perpetrated on Neil Stonechild and his family." I thought with that, my nightmare was over. Little did I know it just began. In November 2004, the commissioner released his findings. He determined that Neil Stonechild was in our custody. His body contained marks that were consistent with handcuffs, even though there was no attempt to prove that. That we had time to drop him off to the north end of the city, even when we had to be in two places at the same time for that to happen. That Jarvis concealed evidence of Jason Roy's disclosure, and that the SP officers since then and further concealed their involvement in Neil Stonechild's death. In justification of his findings, he went so far to make up his own evidence to support an unsubstantiated conclusion made by the RCMP investigators. He made up evidence out of thin air. And I kid you not. Slide 8. The lead investigator's comments in this case. In the wiretap warrant filed by the RCMP officers in this case, they stated that they had to find any evidence to corroborate Jason Roy's story. Later on, the officer who investigated me disclosed that disclosure of our investigation, the RCMP investigation results, would create potential issues with justice if no charges were laid. That meant, now I don't know the exact context of that, but that seems to indicate to me that the RCMP were absolutely desperate to find somebody to blame for a freezing death because their reputation was on the line. Years later, 2008, I sat down with the officer who investigated me. I met him in a coffee shop. I had a video camera with me, and I secretly recorded the conversation. Because if the RCMP taught me anything, it's to be a sneaky bastard. When I asked him why the investigation didn't come to a screeching halt when the report was found and Jason Roy was caught in these lies, this is what he said to me. That had nothing to do with the RCMP though, Larry. By then the process was already in place. Justice was the ones making all the decisions about what was going to happen next. It seems to indicate that the RCMP were not in charge of their own investigation, but were directed by justice to find evidence by any means possible to link a Saskatoon police officer to a freezing death to appease the FSIN, who is demanding a separate justice system. A public inquiry. Public inquiries have been used in Canada for decades, but public inquiries are becoming more and more frequent. A public inquiry is supposed to examine all the evidence available. No evidence is supposed to be excluded. But this public inquiry sets a precedent. Any decision made by a judge is potentially precedent-setting. In this case, a person can be blamed for criminal misconduct without a trial, without being able to call evidence or defend themselves, without being granted the benefit of doubt that would go to an accused person, without the rules of evidence and protection under the law, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with no meaningful recourse under the law. Section 60 of the Police Act, under which I was fired, gives the chief the authority to fire anyone for any reason he chooses. And that's what Russ Sabo did to myself and Brad Senger. A year before I was dismissed, Russ Sabo held me out as a police officer with a true servant's heart, because Russ Sabo knew the things I did as a cop. There are many people here who can testify to the kind of cop I was. The decisions made by those representing justice have perverted it. Not only is this an injustice to me, my family, and my community, and to the Saskatoon Police Service, it's an injustice to the Stonechild family as well. And I wish the loudmouth schmucks were here to hear that. In spite of all the time and effort Neil's mom stated at the conclusion of the inquiry, and Candace McLean has this in her book, because this is from Candace McLean, that she still did not know what happened to her son. For 13 years, we have tried to convince justice officials that there are very serious acts of misconduct in this case, that these acts of misconduct must be fully examined by a federal court judge with subpoena authority to review the case, to identify any misconduct discovered, and to prosecute to the full extent of the law. Instead, Sask Justice said that it didn't matter if Jason Roy lied about the whole thing. It didn't matter if he lied at the public inquiry under oath. It's not in the public interest to pursue charges. And it's not really any big deal anyway, because Brad and I didn't face jeopardy. I can tell you that the best thing that could have happened to me, my family, my police service, is that I were charged with these criminal offenses. this would have been done a long time ago. We wouldn't have created this culture of anger, hatred, blame, fear, and revenge. Since then, we found evidence that people have reported to the RCMP who have direct knowledge who caused Neil Stonechild's death, including an admission from one man who said he killed Neil Stonechild. All I've ever wanted was to be able to clear my name so that my descendants would not have to live with the shame and disgrace and the hate that's been showered on me and other police officers. In closing, this is not only an injustice to me, but many people. The family of those who have been found frozen to death since 2004. The deaths nobody wants to speak about. The fact is that the media, justice, and special interest groups seem to ignore this. Seems to indicate that the deaths in 2000 were merely exploited by those who wanted to advance their careers, increase their public profile, gain political and financial advantage. We can't address problems until we have the courage to face them head on. This is an injustice to those who sacrifice their lives and well-being every day to serve others who are indifferent to them and even hate them. This has done nothing but create more division, suspicion, and hatred. My wish is that we can stop focusing on our differences and focus on our similarities instead. I wish, again, the loudmouth schmucks could hear that. Instead, it's the only way we can live in peace and harmony with each other. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming and hearing us. I hope that you buy Candace's book, When Police Become Prey. There is so much more to this story than I disclosed to you and what's disclosed in the book. You would not believe what happened in this case and how corrupt and evil our justice system and its officials can be. These kind of injustices happened before. They are happening right now, and they will happen again in the future unless you do something about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Our next speaker is former Police Chief Dave Scott. Dave's contract was brought out in the middle of all of this kerfuffle, where innocent lives were being completely derailed. And the reason given for buying out Dave's contract was that he was not doing enough community policing. 3 months after he left the police service, he was given a huge international award by an international committee for his visionary, advanced, cutting-edge community policing practices. So here we have former Chief Dave Scott.
First of all, Larry, Brad, your wives, I commend you. Your valor, your courage is, I couldn't do it. And if you people knew how hard it was for this man to do what he just did, and how some very loving people have helped him over the last few days. Thanks, Candace, for the support you've given him. And thank you for all of you who have come. Boy, I see a lot of familiar faces out there. I hope they don't start telling stories on me. Don't give them the mic tonight. Good friends, fellow police officers, family, loved ones, friends that are so dear to me, and all of you that took the time to come and hear us tonight. I'll just step up a little closer. If I can look over my stomach, then I can see my notes. But truly, I never imagined at my age I would be here to expose Saskatchewan's largest injustice brought against the innocent police officers. I have stated in the past that every day the injustices flash back into my heart and mind. I so wish it had never happened. I grieve over the officers I left on the battlefield. I hope and pray that God will mercifully clear them someday. This injustice has led to me suffering from PTSD, and my family has suffered terribly. However, our suffering does not compare to those officers, Larry Hartwig, who's here, and Brad Senger, their wives, their children, what it has done to them. Reliving this experience creates anxiety in me and is very uncomfortable even 16 years later. And personally, I thank God for giving me the courage to be able to get up here this weekend and do the things that Candace had asked for me. And I admire this woman greatly. She is a renowned investigative reporter. But I am here to support these fallen members and their families and see justice done. Being part of and living through the biggest betrayal in Saskatchewan justice history has provided me some insight and perspective. It was only after being forced into retirement as police chief I became aware of many of these unknowns. And just in the last 2 years, I have found out the truth why they got rid of me as chief. And that'll come out in a later book. This was primarily through the diligence and tenacity of Candace McLean, a renowned investigative journalist as well. Many committed, retired, and serving Saskatoon police members, many of them here tonight. And the Police Association under the leadership of past President Stan Gertsen, who I consider a good friend and ally, and I admire him greatly. And fired Constable Larry Hartwig, who worked tirelessly to assist Candace. Larry, I can't say enough about you. I admire you. The evidence gathered over the years suggests complicity and ineptitude. We encouraged Candace to corroborate what she wrote so that the public would be confident in her writings. She achieved this, and the information, some of which we have only learned in the last year, shocked us. I never believed I would find the depth of such cowardice and lack of courage by RCMP, by police chiefs, by police officers, lawyers, judges, Saskatchewan justice officials, ministers of justice, premiers, mayors, police commissioners, and the media. Many of them I considered were friends of mine at the time. Politically, Saskatchewan needed a fall guy, and we were it. In early 2000, unbeknownst to me, Aboriginal leaders began secretly meeting with RCMP, Saskatchewan Justice, and the Premier to put pressure on them to investigate freezing deaths of Aboriginal men. On February 17, 2000, Saskatoon's newspaper began erroneously reporting on the Daryl Knight allegations. Then on February 22, 2000, Jason Rory made his first public allegations of Neil Stonechild being in police custody 10 years earlier. This was a separate incident which eventually led to the Stonechild inquiry resulting in the firing of these two officers. A few weeks later, in April 2000, Amnesty International joined the fray, and Justice Minister Axworthy writing Justice Minister Axworthy to support the Aboriginal politicians' calls for an inquiry into freezing deaths. And folks, this is where the wheels really started to fall off, and the pressure on us was unbelievable. A month later, Amnesty International's annual report alleged patterns of police abuse against First Nations men in Saskatoon. This report was based solely on unsubstantiated reporting by some journalists before any evidence was produced. And one of those journalists was the one that Larry talked about and how his mind changed totally after the inquiry. Amnesty International repeated this accusation again 1 year later in May 2001. A month after that, I was asked for my resignation by the Police Commission. The firestorm had begun. Many Aboriginal men have died due to severe weather elements and poor choices. Some choose a high-risk lifestyle of using illicit drugs and intoxicants, which leads to criminal behavior and violence. And socially, you can understand that, and we as a society in Canada need to help these people, because if we had to live in the poverty that some of them do, you could understand more clearly why they do what they do. Justice does ride a slow mule. Political correctness has risen to a level where fear has completely replaced common sense. After getting off the stand at the Stonechild inquiry, I realized this was simply a witch hunt of unimaginable proportions. Recognizing I had been blindsided at the inquiry by being accused on the stand of illegal activities, which I had never even heard of before, I called the inquiry lawyers, Heshie and Stack, for the Stonechild inquiry. I told them how devastated I was with their actions and realizing they were discrediting us. I requested to be called to the inquiry the following day. They informed me they would speak to Justice Wright and get back to me the next day. I never, ever was called back. Also, while I was on the stand, Cy Hellick, lawyer for FSIN, alleged I dropped off 2 persons on 8th Street past the cemetery, and that I had spoken with retired Staff Sergeant Jarvis, the officer who investigated the death of Stonechild, about evidence at the inquiry. Thirdly, that I had called Darrell Knight the evening the 2 police officers came forward admitting their wrongdoing and offered to resolve the issue with a healing circle. All false. I called Cy that night and I told him his allegations broke my heart, as he knew I would never do anything like that. He agreed and said the allegations were in disclosure documents given to him by FSIN, and he had to ask the questions. Prior to this testimony, Cy was a friend of mine, and we have not spoken since. After the Stonechild inquiry report and before the 2 officers were fired, Deputy Justice Minister Doug Moen commented to Stan Gertson and others, remarks that Stan will talk to you about tonight, that literally stun you. You stand there and you wonder, what in the world is going on? Then you realize it's all part of the witch hunt. All we have ever asked is that Saskatchewan Justice appoint an out-of-province federal judge to review this case. The judge should have subpoena and resolution power with the assistance of 2 senior municipal police investigators and ourselves as a resource. The current Minister of Justice, Don Morgan, who is in charge of this file, continues to deny us this right. To muzzle us after the Stonechild inquiry, civil suits in the tens of millions of dollars were brought against us, many of them still open. How we wish they would have proceeded, because we would have been prepared now knowing more details. We knew their threats were frivolous and only for media attention, and to instill in the public's mind forever that we had been involved in some way with these freezing deaths. In preparation for the Stonechild inquiry, lawyers lined up at the public trough to bill hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees at taxpayers' expense. RCMP investigators were not called to give their evidence. False credentials were given by one expert whose evidence was damning. A key witness that saw Stonechild in the north end of Saskatoon the night he froze to death was videotaped and interviewed by the RCMP, but he was never called to give evidence. I found out about him through my son. That's how we got to know him. I went and interviewed him myself years after I was done as chief. I was stunned when he told me. He had the business card of the member that had still interviewed him. Evidence was manipulated, not presented, dismissed, ignored, and fabricated. Saskatoon police ordered crime analyst documents destroyed. Again, that was part of the process. Get rid of the evidence. Documents that would have shown that Neil Stonechild was never in the custody of any Saskatoon police officer. Why did they not pass the analyst's work on to the RCMP, who never did do a crime analyst report? The Stonechild inquiry was merely a sideshow with skewed witnesses and evidence. The outcome destroyed careers and lives. The tragedy remains as we live the rest of our lives under suspicion of being involved in the freezing deaths of Aboriginal men. Evil stripped us bare. Saskatchewan justice officials, police leaders, and RCMP continue their pathway of betrayal and remaining politically correct. This is but a brief summary of what happened. My hope is that our story will resonate and with those who wish to maintain a fair justice system. It's disturbing that Saskatchewan justice continues to ignore our efforts in seeking justice when faced with overwhelming evidence that injustices have occurred. And I have tried and tried from 2008 to 2014 to meet with Justice Minister Don Morgan. I've met him twice personally. The first time, after I wrote a letter, I never got a reply. I then phoned and phoned, they denied me a meeting. I said, if I don't get a meeting and if I don't hear today, I'm going to the media. Within an hour, he called me and we set up a meeting. And that was in 2008. This is a brief summary of what happened. My hope is that our story will resonate with I think I've said that. Do we not deserve the same rights as those who persecuted us? Is this what happens to police officers who honorably serve their people? And I tell you, we will not be shaken. in our resolve to clear our names and reputations. I am sickened by what this witch hunt has done to our families. Bad people did bad things to good people. Powerful people hurt us bad. Premier Wall, Minister Goodale, Minister Wilson-Raybould, you have the power, you have the authority, you have the responsibility to do something about this terrible injustice. Do what is right. Appoint a federal court judge with subpoena and resolution authority to renew all our evidence. And I thank all of you for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see your faces, and I hope that in some way our voice does get heard. Thanks again.
I can't tell you how many hours and hours and hours former Chief Scott has put into answering my questions, many of them not too bright because I didn't know how on earth police conducted their business, and he has been so patient and kept his sense of humor, and I appreciate so much all the time and effort that you've put into this book, Dave. I do want to tell you that my next book is going to be titled Police Chief Dave Scott and the Crisis in Politically Correct Justice. So that's going to be interesting. I also appreciate all the time and help that Larry Hartwig has given to me. But I have to say, I probably wouldn't have endured till the end in writing this book if it hadn't been for Stan Gertzen. Stan knows when I phone and have a tremble in my voice that I need some moral support, and he's always given it. And I'm just so grateful to Stan. So that is our last speaker tonight. Stan was the president of the Police Association for years and years and years. He just kept getting reelected and reelected. And he retired in 2013. And to this day, I bother him once or twice a week, and he never gives me the impression that I'm being a complete pain in the patoot. He continues on to give his support to his men to this day. So here is Stan Gertzen.
If Dave figured he had a hard time looking over his belly, he should be up here right now. I'm going to hold this up because it's a lot easier with these fancy glasses that I have, so just bear with me, folks. I'll stick to the script so it's nice and short because I see a lot of people getting a little tired. So I think the biggest question I have to ask, or I think a lot of people ask, is why is this still an issue with our community? It's unfortunate, it is an unfortunate fact that innocent people are sometimes wrongfully accused and punished for something that they didn't do. And you would just have to ask somebody who's been through that's been wrongfully accused. For example, somebody who was wrongfully accused by 3 children out in Martinsville who admitted that they lied. Or Susan Nellis at the Toronto Sick Children's Hospital. She was later shown to be totally innocent, and yet she went through hell, similar to what Larry and Brad have been going through. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of this where people have been unjustly accused and treated. And to say that Larry and Brad have been unjustly treated and accused doesn't go nearly far enough, but that's what we'll use for a description. Everyone deserves the ability to defend themselves. Larry and Brad were not given that opportunity to defend their innocence at no time. And if anybody questions this, again, just like I told the people before, I'd be more than happy to stick around and I'll answer all your questions. These 2 officers were never charged with anything and have never been found guilty of anything for a reason. They never had contact with Neil Stonechild, and they've been used as scapegoats in one of the largest witch hunts in Canadian history. Wrong is wrong, even if you don't like the police. The inquiry was off the tracks from the beginning. They didn't follow the terms of reference for inquiries. He wasn't supposed to assign blame. They're supposed to accept and look and examine any and all information, regardless of where it was from or what it might lead to. As you've heard here, key evidence was disregarded. For example, Dr. Emma Lou, world-famous pathologist, totally disregarded in favor of a map maker. Sounds reasonable. Lies were ignored or glossed over by the RCMP investigators. I can take you through a chronology of Jason Roy's lies, and it's astounding how he would get caught in a lie. He would have to change his story and come up with a new one. For example, he never told anybody about Larry and Brad or his buddy being in the back of a police car until there were issues around Saskatoon. All of a sudden, the media was interested. Then he came forward and suddenly, yeah, I remember my buddy in the back of a police car. He even described them. He told the Mounties that the policeman involved was over 6 feet tall, Coke bottle glasses, a mustache, curly hair. Stand up, Leonard Watkins. Okay? Larry's a little runt. I don't even know if he could grow a mustache.
Can. Honestly, can.
So when Jason Roy, and Jason Roy didn't know about what physical characteristics they had until the inquiry. And then all of a sudden Jason Roy has to come to the inquiry and he gets caught. Now he's got to change his story. At the inquiry he goes, you know what? I was riding on the bus one day and there was this big tall guy with curly dark hair and Coke bottle glasses and a mustache, and he was looking at me, and I thought he was a policeman. And that's where I got the description from. Okay, beautiful. Well, what happened then? Well, I told the police back in the day that, you know, exactly what I've told you. And this went on, and the RCMP ate it up, and they continued on with their investigation. They're getting paid a lot of overtime. They get to stay in a lot of nice hotels. And Jason Roy's also kept in a hotel, and his beer and his food are all paid for. Good gig if you can get it. The problem for Jason Roy is that Ernie Lutet went and found the original report partway through the inquiry. And Ernie brings a report forward where there just happens to be a handwritten statement in Jason Roy's own handwriting saying, me and Neil went out, we're going to do a break-in, we're going to blah, 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 blah. We had an argument, I left and I went back. You can see that in the book. Candace has it in the book. Another reason to get the book, because you can actually look at all these details in minutia. How does Jason Roy explain away this lie? Well, he goes, you know what? I remember giving that statement. That statement that's dated, I think it was November 29th or 30th? November 30th, my memory isn't as good. I really didn't write that statement out on November 30th. December 20th is around my birthday. And I got arrested at the sand store. And when the Saskatoon police arrested me at the sand store, they needed me to change the story, because I told them initially what I've just told you Mounties. So when they arrested me on December 20th, they took me into the station, and I was in fear for my life. I got to tell you, I thought they were going to do to me what they did to my buddy Jason. So when they got me into the station, they made me fill out that statement that you see dated November 30th. Yes, it's in my handwriting, but I did it because I thought I was going to die. The problem is, the statement that he's referring to is photographed, photocopied, by Ernie Lutet, as was explained earlier, on December 4th, just before Ernie photocopied the file so that he could go over to the Stonechild family and say, look, this is what's here, I'm looking into it, we're doing our best, I'm not happy with some of this stuff, and he was going to have an open, honest conversation with that family. The problem is, and Larry alluded to this, It's photographed or photocopied on December 4th, but he says he never wrote it till December 20th. Could I get you to present something here that you write out 2 weeks from now? Because that's what Commission Counsel, the Commission, what they're all asked to believe. That's the kind of stuff that got bought. That was another story. So, okay. And I can think of about, I've got them written down. I'm not going to beat you over the head with them. There's about 27 different times where he goes, yeah, no, and he changes his story simply because he gets caught in another lie, and another lie, and another lie. I've said a number of times publicly, Jason Roy is a liar. I haven't had any lawyers knocking on my door saying that I need to get my ass suit off. My phone just went out. I'm going to look for my place again. Larry showed me this one. Flawed facts equal flawed conclusions. Justice Wright says that in order for his theory to work, and I got to thank Dan Wicks and Roy Fleming, Norm Dole, Murray Zork, and there's a few, and I've probably missed some, because they put in a lot of time going over timeline stuff and reviewing testimony from the inquiry, and it was horrible, tedious work, but it got done. And there's one key hour where Justice Wright says that Larry and Brad would have had to have checked Bruce Janile between the hours of 10 and 11. That's his words, and it's right in the commission report. The problem with that, Larry and Brad weren't working together ever. They never worked together before that night. They showed up at their first call on Tash Crescent at 10:59 that night. So how could they have checked Bruce Janile, which is what Justice Wright said they did, in order to make everything in his conclusion work? And I'll gladly stick around after if somebody has some questions about this stuff too, because it's quite simple to explain. Why did this happen? Oh.
Just tell us.
Candace, I need to be more correct than I would be, so I'm going to stick to the script. Please bear with me. Here we are. Why did this happen? In my opinion, and I want to get this very accurate, in my opinion, the provincial government did not want the truth to come out because it meant they would have had to have answered some real tough questions about why so many Aboriginal people have died from exposure right across this province. And this is still happening today, by the way. You're going to hear about more people dying of exposure in this province. Some of these deaths can be directly attributed to addictions and lifestyle choices, but the counterpoint to that is that those same type of lifestyles aren't as prevalent, or those issues aren't as prevalent when a person isn't living in poverty. Dave alluded to that. There's social issues that have to be addressed. This would have been the perfect platform for the FSIN and the Native community to push the province for their own legal system, for social concessions, you name it, to deal with the biggest issues that they have in their community in an urban setting, which is crimes and addictions. And how do you deal with that? You address the poverty. In my opinion, the province and Sask Justice in particular decided to use two innocent humans as scapegoats to placate the First Nations by lying to them and saying, look, we found the bad guys, now just be quiet and go away. I believe that two innocent people were wrongly accused by a judge who didn't get to hear all of the facts because of the skewed investigation and the desire by the province via Sask Justice to shut down broader-based real social concerns among the Native and the FSIN. I based my beliefs that 2 innocent people were sacrificed for political reasons on what was said to me by then Deputy Minister of Sask Justice, Doug Moen. After Justice Wright's report came out, and this was just before Larry and Brad were actually fired, I met, me and 2 other police officers from the Saskatchewan Federation of Police Officers met with Doug Moen. We challenged him throughout that meeting because at the inquiry, at the end of that inquiry, not one group in the summations that are there by the lawyers, that's the FSIN, the Stonechild family, there wasn't one group that pointed at Larry and Brad in their summations to Justice Wright. These are the people that should have been trying to stick a fork in us. Not one of those lawyers mentioned Larry and Brad. In fact, they're coming up with alternative ideas, twist ties, the paddy wagon, you name it. I kept pushing Doug Moen, who's later, I guess, deputy premier around this place. I kept pushing Doug Moen, and at the end of the meeting, Doug Moen looked at me and verbatim said, "Stan, it really doesn't matter whether these 2 guys have done anything wrong or not. These 2 guys have got to go." There's notes on that, there's witnesses, that happened. Sask Justice never wanted the truth to come out of this. My shame is that I believed in the system all the way through this. I believed in the system from when I was a little kid through this inquiry. That all ended when Doug Moen said that. After Doug Moen said that, if you're the FSIN or if you're the Stonechild family and you believe that your child has been murdered, somebody has to pay. That should never end. People should be going after somebody if they honestly believe that they caused the death of Neil Stonechild. All of a sudden, they aren't investigating anything. All the lawsuits just go away because the lawyers have been paid for their inquiry time. Nobody's been sued, folks. Two or 3 years after this, there's an inmate at Bowden Institute that's being interviewed by an RCMP out of Regina, and the RCMP out of Regina is looking into sexual abuse charges from the early 1990s at Dojak in Regina. He takes a statement from the prisoner. The prisoner says, okay, that's everything I have to say. Then the prisoner asks him, what are you guys doing about the information I gave you regarding Stonechild? Mountie looks at him and goes, I don't know, I didn't work on it, but I'll take a statement. That officer has extra tape in his recorder. He takes a statement, he goes back to Saskatchewan, Regina. He transcribes everything, and he takes it into Regina Major Crimes. Because they're the ones in Regina RCMP Major Crimes. Make sure that mistake. He takes it in, hands it over to them, and he goes back to his investigation, stuff about sexual assault and whatnot. He checks to see what's happened with the information that he's come up with and forwarded it to Major Crimes about 6-7 weeks later. It's not on the file. So at that point, he's concerned, he looks around, he still can't find it. A person contacts us, lets us know that this has happened. And rather than, and again, because of the public controversy that's just swirled and swirled around this, who knows, if we'd made some allegation that wasn't substantiated, we would have been roasted again. So we had our lawyer get a hold of Bruce Gibson, who was the RCMP counsel at the inquiry. And we asked Bruce, can you look into this? It doesn't sound like something that an RCMP officer would do, you know, failing to put information into a file like this. So Bruce Gibson looks into it unofficially just to see if there's any fire to the smoke that we're complaining about. Shortly after our lawyer makes that phone call, Jack Warner, who was the lead investigator for the RCMP, retired. The statement that was taken at Bowden had been turned over to Jack Warner, who was in Regina RCMP Major Crimes. Jack Warner was the lead investigator on Stonechild. Shortly after Jack Warner retired, the FSIN hired him. I can go on and on and on, folks. Unfortunately, I've had to live vicariously what Larry's gone through. And I'm not going to keep going because some of this, I hope, will get presented to a judge. And if they do, I can back up everything that I've said. I have witnesses for everything. I used to be a crime analyst, thanks to Dave and company for sending me off for all that training. And it's all been documented. I'll stick around just like I offered the other folks too. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you to everyone for coming out. Candace, thank you.
So basically, the message to take away is that we need each and every one of you to write a letter to your MP or MLA or both and say, we want a judicial review of the evidence that has been discovered in relation to the Neil Stonechild case. I think if we get a judge from another province, that's very important that you add that, that any person who looks at this evidence for longer than 5 hours will be just shaking their head in amazement that any of this could have gone forward. And I believe there was some tunnel vision involved in the RCMP investigation, but I just don't see how anybody could have looked at that evidence for very long without thinking to themselves, this simply does not add up. And what just is the saddest thing of all is they didn't stop there. They kept right on going to scapegoat 2 innocent men and completely derail their lives. This has got to be dealt with, and the only way it will be dealt with is if citizens like you make the effort to write to your MPs and MLAs in enough numbers that they have to take action. So good, let's have some questions.
Candace,
Yeah?
can I make a point?
Yes.
Read the book first before you write a letter, okay? The book contains a lot of the facts that we're talking about. It contains the reference material that Candace refers to. Don't trust my word for anything. Read it for yourself.
Yes, sir.
Candace, I just wanted to make one comment
Yes.
on the dismissal of Larry and Brad.
Yes.
Chief Russell Sable came on parade. I was a patrol sergeant with the SPS. He made the announcement that he was dismissing these 2 officers. At that time, he stated, I at no time believed that these 2 did anything wrong. But sometimes, you've got to cut off a finger to save a hand. Very similar to what the Justice Department said these guys had to do. They were fired by a man who did not believe they were guilty.
Actually, I can speak to that too because I spoke to a member who was on that shift at that time lane. And actually,
5 of us, Larry.
yeah. I heard that same rumor. Unfortunately, I wasn't on parade because I was already fired, right? But on C Platoon, Russ Sable and Lauren Konstantinoff spoke to Parade, and Chief Sabo said that he did not believe that Neil Stonechild was in our car that night. He told the entire parade notes were taken in field officers' notebooks and are retained to this day. At that time, when Russ Sabo realized what he stepped into, he tried to backpedal. Lauren Konstantinoff then stated, sometimes it's better to sever a couple of fingers than to lose the whole hand. There are notes, police officers have the notes in that particular case, and they are available upon subpoena for those records. Unfortunately, we need to get there, and the only way we get there is through your help. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I wonder if you could get an explanation on how to get the case reviewed by a federal court. I think you mentioned that it has to go through Morgan. Is there no way of getting it directly to the Minister of Justice?
Yes, the question is, how do we get them involved to appoint a federal court judge? Just over a week ago, I wrote a letter to Premier Wall. I wrote a letter to the Minister, Ralph Goodell, who is in charge of the RCMP under the federal government. And I wrote a letter to the Minister, the Attorney General for Canada, Wilson Raybould. And in that letter, they're very short, but I'm simply asking them, they have the authority. They can do that. And I've had these discussions, exactly what I'm just talking about, with the Assistant Justice Minister, Don Morgan, who has this file, and I've had written and verbal talks with him since 2008 on the specific thing I'm just talking to you about right now. And as recent as 3 years ago, I wrote both him and Premier Wall, and Premier Wall wrote me back and said, thank me, I know him personally, and that the file was under Morgan's periphery, and he would get hold of me for these discussions or whatever, keep me posted. I've never heard from him.
I did. Okay. I'll just talk to that for a minute. In 2011, I filed a criminal misconduct complaint against Jason Roy and against Gary Robertson for perjury, criminal mischief. That file in 2011 was handed over to the Saskatoon Police Service, and the file was sealed by our current chief. He recommended that I go back to the RCMP to file a complaint with them. So I did. The RCMP refused twice to review their own evidence. Through the work of Stan Gertson and our police association, they fought diligently to get it in the hands of our justice minister. Don Morgan was replaced by, throw out the name, Gordon Wyant. But Gordon Wyant was in practice with Joel Heshe, who was commissioned counsel. We argued that there would be conflict. So it got bounced back to Don Morgan, who essentially assured us, and am I speaking out of turn here?
Daryl Rayner and Justice.
Right. So he sent, two of them, Daryl Rayner and, yeah, okay, well,
Just Justice.
yeah, Justice, okay? So in 2015, I got a reply from Justice. And that reply was, as I've said, in part, it's not in the public interest to pursue any action here. Doesn't matter if Jason Roy lied or not. It was up to the commissioner to determine if he is credible or not, and what parts were credible and what were not, okay? And it's really not a big deal anyway, because Larry and Brad were never charged. Okay, I've got the letter, I can show it to you. In fact, I've got it right here.
Excuse me, you keep speaking of the commissioner.
Right.
And that's David Wright?
Yes.
Is that the person?
Yes. But commission counsel was Joel Heshe.
It was commission counsel's job to call witnesses. Even though Keith Jarvis argued that the RCMP engaged in serious misconduct, potentially criminal misconduct, in regards to his statement. And in spite of the commissioner recognizing this, and in spite of demands to have those RCMP officers testify, it was Joel Heschey's decision to exclude them. The reasons are obvious. No one has ever, as far as I know, and how many police officers do we have here? Has there ever been an investigation where the investigating officers were excluded from testifying at a trial? Not one. Not one. Thanks.
We're in no big rush to leave, so come and talk to the people involved, and we do have some books here if anybody wants one.